English, I caught my son trying to sell his late mother's necklace for drug money, so I taught him what its true worth was. Vietnamese, Toi bat gap con tre dang ko ban soi de chien qua nuoi mi qua ko de lay tien dung chat cam, nin toi de cho no beat gia tri tuk su qua no la gi. The locket is cold in my palm. Colder than the autumn air that drifts into my workshop through the open door, carrying the scent of damp earth and sawdust. It's a simple thing, a silver oval no bigger than my thumb, worn smooth by the years. On the front, an engraving of a tree, a willow. Sarah had called it its branches reaching, sheltering. I run my thumb over the familiar lines, the metal a dead weight against my skin. A weight of memory. A weight of failure. This little piece of silver has seen more than most things. It rested against my wife's heart for 17 years. It held the warmth of her skin, rose and fell with her breath, absorbed her laughter and her tears. Inside, behind a tiny clasp, is a picture. A younger me, a radiant Sarah, and a baby with a tuft of blonde hair, swaddled in a blue blanket. Our greatest creation, she used to say. Our Leo. Now, the locket sits in my calloused hand, a relic of a life that feels like it belonged to someone else. It is the anchor point of my story, the silent witness to the day the silence in my house finally broke. The day I learned that grief, when left untended, doesn't just fade away. It festers. It turns toxic. And it nearly cost me everything I had left. The day I found my son trying to sell his mother's soul for a handful of cash. 2 months earlier, the silence was just a fact of life. It had settled into our home in Portland the day we lost Sarah, 2 years prior, and had never truly left. It wasn't an angry silence, not at first. It was a heavy, mournful quiet, the kind that fills a space once occupied by a vibrant life. The house itself seemed to grieve. The fiddle-leaf fig Sarah had doted on was dropping its leaves. The colorful quilt she draped over the armchair was folded away in a closet. Her presence was an absence, a shape defined by the emptiness she'd left behind. My life had shrunk to the 4 walls of my workshop. The scent of cedar and pine was my refuge. The rhythm of the saw, the patient scrape of the hand plane, the meticulous joining of wood, these were my therapy. I built cabinets, tables, and chairs, pouring all the words I couldn't say into the grain of the wood. Out there, surrounded by my tools, I could pretend I was in control. I was David Miller, the craftsman. Not David Miller, the widower. Not David Miller, the father who didn't know how to talk to his own son. Leo's world had shrunk to his bedroom. He was 17, a senior in high school, but he moved through the house like a ghost. The bright, artistic kid who used to fill notebooks with sketches and blast music from his room was gone. In his place was a sullen, withdrawn stranger who communicated in grunts and shrugs. His door was always closed. The music was always off. Our only point of intersection was the dinner table. Every night at 6:30, I'd call him from the kitchen. He'd emerge from his room, slide into his chair, and we'd eat in near total silence. The only sounds were the clinking of our forks against the ceramic plates. How was school? I'd ask, the words feeling clumsy and loud in the quiet room. Fine, he'd mumble, eyes fixed on his plate. Anything interesting happen? A shrug. Not really. And that would be it. We would finish our meal, he would mumble a thanks and retreat back to his room, the click of his door closing like a final verdict. I told myself it was normal. He was a teenager. He was grieving. I was grieving. We were just processing it differently. He needed his space, and I needed my work. This was how we survived. I see now that I wasn't just grieving, I was in denial. I saw the signs, but I chose not to understand them. I saw how his hoodies hung loosely on his shrinking frame, how his once bright eyes were now dull and ringed with shadows. I noticed the $20 bills that would disappear from my wallet, the ones I left on the kitchen counter. I'd convinced myself I'd misplaced them, or that he'd needed it for lunch money, even though I packed his lunch every morning. It was easier to believe in my own forgetfulness than to confront the alternative. It was easier to retreat to the workshop and sand down another piece of oak until it was perfectly smooth. The breaking point didn't happen in our quiet, sterile house. It happened in a place of noise and desperation, a place I never would have associated with my son. A pawn shop. It was a Tuesday, one of those relentlessly gray Portland afternoons where the sky weeps a steady, misty drizzle. My vintage Stanley hand plane had finally given up the ghost, the blade chipped beyond repair. I knew a place downtown, a cluttered old pawn shop called Second Chance, that sometimes had good quality, forgotten tools for cheap. The idea of rescuing a well-made tool from a dusty shelf appealed to the craftsman in me. The bell above the door chimed weakly as I entered, the air inside thick with the smell of dust, old electronics, and a faint, sad perfume of other people's misfortunes. The place was a maze of discarded histories. Glass cases filled with tarnished jewelry, shelves groaning under the weight of outdated game consoles, guitars hanging from the ceiling like strange fruit. I was heading toward the back, where the tools were usually piled in a chaotic heap, when I saw him. He was at the main counter, his back to me. But I knew that posture. The slight slump of his shoulders, the way his dark hair curled over the collar of his worn-out gray hoodie. My first thought was confusion. What was Leo doing here? Was he selling an old video game? An old phone? I stopped, partially hidden behind a rack of leather jackets that smelled of cigarette smoke. The man behind the counter was large and balding, with a bored expression. He was peering at something small on the glass countertop. And then Leo moved his hand, and I saw it. My breath caught in my throat. It felt like a punch to the stomach, knocking all the air out of my lungs. On the grimy glass, glinting under the dim fluorescent lights, was Sarah's locket. The world seemed to slow down. I could see every detail. The delicate silver chain pooled around it. The way the light caught the engraved branches of the willow tree. It looked so out of place, so sacred and pure in this graveyard of broken dreams. That locket belonged in a small, velvet-lined box on the dresser in my bedroom, the one I hadn't had the heart to move. It did not belong here. It's real silver, I heard Leo say, his voice thin and shaky. A voice I barely recognized. It's vintage. The pawnbroker picked it up with thick, indifferent fingers, turning it over. Not much weight to it. Engraving is nice, I guess. I'll give you $40 for it. $40. The words echoed in the sudden, roaring silence in my head. He was selling his mother's memory for $40. He was selling the symbol of our family, the gift I'd given her the day we found out she was pregnant with him, for the price of a few pizzas. Something cold and hard formed in my chest. It wasn't just anger. It was a profound, shattering sense of betrayal. The silence I had cultivated, the distance I had allowed to grow between us, had led to this. My denial had led to this. I stepped out from behind the rack of jackets. My footsteps felt heavy on the worn linoleum floor. Leo. My voice was quiet, dangerously so. But it cut through the air like a razor. He flinched as if he'd been struck. He spun around, his face a mask of pure panic. His eyes were wide, his skin pale and clammy. He saw me, and whatever color was left in his cheeks drained away. "Dad," he stammered, his eyes darting from me to the locket in the pawnbroker's hand. This isn't what it looks like." The lie was so pathetic, so transparent, it was almost insulting. The pawnbroker looked from me to Leo, his bored expression shifting to one of mild interest. He was smelling a story. I ignored him. I walked right up to the counter, my eyes locked on my son's. "What are you doing, Leo?" I asked again, my voice low and steady, belying the tremor that was starting in my hands. I found it. I was just seeing what it was worth," he lied again, the words tumbling out of his mouth. I didn't say anything. I just held his gaze. I let the silence stretch, let the weight of his lie hang in the air between us. He couldn't meet my eyes. His gaze dropped to the floor. I turned to the pawnbroker, who was still holding the locket. "That belongs to me," I said, my voice flat. I held out my hand. He hesitated for a second, then shrugged and dropped the locket and its chain into my open palm. The metal felt ice-cold, contaminated. I closed my fist around it. The edges of the oval dug into my skin. I turned back to Leo. I didn't yell. I didn't cause a scene. I just said 2 words. "Let's go." I grabbed his upper arm. His bicep was frighteningly thin beneath the fabric of his hoodie. He didn't resist. He just let me lead him out of the shop, past the staring eyes of the pawnbroker. The little bell chimed our exit. The walk to my truck was the longest walk of my life. The Portland drizzle had turned into a steady rain, plastering his hair to his forehead. Neither of us said a word. I opened the passenger door, and he climbed in, hunching into himself as if trying to disappear. I got into the driver's seat, the engine turning over with a familiar rumble. I didn't drive home right away. I just sat there, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. The locket was a hard, painful lump in my pocket. The rhythmic thump-thump of the windshield wipers was the only sound, counting out the seconds of a silence that was no longer empty, but filled with everything I had refused to see. Betrayal. Lies. And a terrifying, unnamed sickness that I finally understood had taken root in my home, in my son. The drive home would be short, but I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that the real storm was just about to begin. The drive home was suffocating. The silence in the cab of the truck was a living thing, a third passenger that sat between us, heavy and hostile. I could feel Leo's anxiety radiating from the passenger seat. He kept his eyes fixed on the rain-streaked side window, watching the blur of familiar Portland neighborhoods pass by like scenes from a movie he wasn't in. I kept my eyes on the road, but my mind was a maelstrom. $40. The number kept flashing in my head like a neon sign. What did he need $40 for? The real answer was a dark, shapeless thing that I had been avoiding for months, and now it was sitting right next to me. I pulled into our driveway, the tires crunching on the wet gravel. The house looked the same as Always's sturdy, dependable craftsman-style home with a welcoming front porch. But today, it felt like a stage set for a tragedy. I turned off the engine, and the sudden quiet was even more profound. "Get inside," I said, my voice hoarse. Leo fumbled with the door handle and practically fled from the truck, hurrying up the walkway with his head down, his hoodie pulled up against the rain. He was a stranger running for cover in his own home. I followed slowly, the cold weight of the locket in my pocket a constant, heavy reminder of the confrontation to come. He was already in the living room when I walked in, standing awkwardly in the middle of the rug, dripping water onto the hardwood floor. He wouldn't look at me. "Take off your jacket," I told him. He flinched at the command but did as he was told, dropping the damp hoodie onto the floor. He was shivering, but I wasn't sure if it was from the cold or from fear. Underneath, he wore a faded t-shirt, and I could clearly see the sharp angles of his collarbones, the hollow at the base of his throat. My son was wasting away right in front of me, and I had been too busy in my workshop to notice. I walked over and stood in front of him, forcing him to finally lift his head and meet my eyes. His were glassy, the pupils unervingly small. "Why?" I asked. It was the only word I could manage. I don't know," he mumbled, his voice cracking. "Don't you dare lie to me again, Leo. Not today. Why were you selling your mother's locket?" His face crumpled. A tear escaped and traced a path down his pale cheek. "I needed money." "For what?" I pressed, my voice rising despite my efforts to control it. "For what, Leo? What is so important that you would sell the one thing she cherished most?" He shook his head, a sob catching in his throat. "You wouldn't understand. Try me. The words exploded out of me, a raw, ragged shout that echoed in the quiet house. It was the first time I had raised my voice in 2 years. It felt alien. It felt terrifying. Try me. Because right now, all I understand is that my son, the son I raised, the son your mother adored, was willing to trade her memory for $40. That's when he broke. The fear in his eyes was replaced by a flash of anger, a desperate, cornered animal fury. Her memory, he spat, his voice laced with a bitterness that stunned me. What do you know about her memory? You live in that workshop. You hide from it. You hide from me. That's not true. It is true, he yelled, taking a step toward me, his fists clenched at his sides. When was the last time you even said her name? When was the last time you asked how I was doing? Not, how was school, but how I was really doing. You haven't looked at me in 2 years, Dad. You look right through me. It's like when she died, I died too, and you just haven't noticed yet. His words hit me harder than any physical blow. They were true. Each one was a perfectly aimed dart, puncturing the fragile shell of denial I had built around myself. I had avoided talking about Sarah because it hurt too much. I had avoided looking at Leo too closely because he had her eyes, her smile, and seeing them was a constant, painful reminder of what I had lost. I had mistaken my own suffocating grief for his need for space. But my shock was quickly overwhelmed by the gnawing question. That doesn't explain the money, Leo. Tell me what you need it for. He deflated, the anger draining out of him, leaving behind a raw, trembling vulnerability. He hugged his arms around his thin frame. I owe someone money. Who? For what? My heart was pounding. I knew, but I needed to hear him say it. He wouldn't answer. He just stood there, shaking. I took a step closer, my voice dropping again, this time filled with a dawning horror. Is it drugs, Leo? Are you on drugs? He flinched, a silent confession. The dark, shapeless fear had a name now. Opioids. It all clicked into place. The missing money. The weight loss. The lethargy. The secretive behavior. The desperate attempt to pawn the locket. It wasn't teenage angst. It was addiction. A wave of nausea washed over me. How did it start? The doctor who prescribed him OxyContin after he broke his wrist playing soccer last year had it started then. Had he been fighting this battle all alone, right under my roof, while I was in the backyard sanding a piece of maple? The guilt was a physical thing, a crushing weight on my chest. I reached out to put a hand on his shoulder, but he recoiled, stumbling backward. Don't touch me, he whispered, his eyes wide with a fear that was no longer of me, but of himself, of what he had become. You don't get to be a dad now. It's too late. He turned and bolted up the stairs. I heard his bedroom door slam shut, the sound of final, definitive crack in the foundation of our family. I stood there in the living room, alone, the sound of his accusation still ringing in my ears. It's too late. I sank into the armchair, the one Sarah used to love, and buried my face in my hands. The craftsman, the man who could fix anything with wood and glue, was completely, utterly powerless. I couldn't build a solution for this. I couldn't sand away the ugliness. My son was in trouble, deep, life-threatening trouble, and my silence had been my accomplice. Shouting at him hadn't worked. Pleading with him hadn't worked. The routine we had fallen into was a slow poison. It's too late. No. I wouldn't accept that. I couldn't. I pulled the locket from my pocket. It was warm now, having absorbed the heat from my hand. I looked at the engraved willow, its branches reaching, sheltering. Sarah. What would she have done? She wouldn't have been silent. She wouldn't have hidden. She would have fought. She fought cancer for 3 years with a grace and strength that I could only marvel at. She never gave up. And I wouldn't give up on her greatest creation. An idea began to form in my mind, born of pure desperation. We couldn't stay here. This house was a tomb filled with ghosts and bad habits. His room was his prison. My workshop was my hideout. The city, with its dark corners and easy access to whatever he was taking, was the enemy. We had to get away. We had to break the pattern completely. I stood up, a new resolve hardening inside me. The grief was still there, a raw, open wound. The guilt was still there, a heavy cloak on my shoulders. But for the first time in a long time, there was also a flicker of purpose. I couldn't fix the past. I couldn't undo the last 2 years of silence. But the future was not yet written. I walked to the bottom of the stairs and looked up at his closed door. I didn't shout. I spoke in a clear, firm voice that I hoped would carry through the wood. "Leo," I called out. "Pack a bag. We're leaving in the morning." I didn't wait for a response. I didn't know if he would obey. I didn't even know exactly where we were going yet. All I knew was that the silence was over. I had to get my son back, and I would tear down the world I had built to do it. I walked into the kitchen, my mind racing. I thought of the mountains. Mount Hood, standing like a silent, snow-capped sentinel to the east. I remembered a rental agency that had small, isolated cabins. No cell service. No internet. No distractions. No escape. It was a drastic, desperate plan. Maybe it was a terrible one. But it was a plan. And right now, that was all I had. I would take him away from everything he knew, everything that was feeding his sickness. I would take him to a place so quiet that we would have no choice but to finally hear each other. The drive east on Highway 26 was a new kind of silent. It wasn't the heavy, mournful silence of our house, or the tense, accusatory silence after the pawn shop. This was a stubborn, resentful silence. Leo sat pressed against the passenger door, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, a fortress of teenage fury. He hadn't said a single word since I'd hauled his duffel bag out to the truck at dawn. He'd complied, but with a hostility that radiated off him in waves. His face, visible in the reflection of the side mirror, was a stony mask. He was my prisoner, and he was making sure I knew it. I didn't try to force conversation. The time for words would come later. For now, the plan was simply to move. To put distance between us and the city, between Leo and his demons. With every mile we drove away from Portland, leaving its gray, damp skyline behind, I felt a knot in my own chest loosen just a fraction. The landscape began to change, the urban sprawl giving way to dense forests of Douglas fir and western red cedar. The air grew cleaner, sharper. Ahead of us, the magnificent, white peak of Mount Hood rose against the crisp blue sky, a silent, imposing promise of isolation. I had found a cabin online late last night, a place called The Eyrie. The pictures showed a simple, one-room log structure perched on a wooded hillside, with a stone fireplace and no mention of Wi-Fi. The description said, "A perfect place to unplug and reconnect with nature." I was hoping it would be a perfect place to reconnect with my son. Or, at the very least, a place he couldn't run from. After another hour, I turned off the main highway onto a smaller, winding road, and then onto an even smaller, unpaved gravel track that climbed steeply into the woods. The truck bounced and jostled over the ruts. Leo shot me a venomous look, as if the bumpy road was a personal affront. Finally, I saw it. The cabin was nestled in a small clearing, exactly as promised. It was rustic, solid, and utterly isolated. A plume of thin smoke was already rising from the stone chimney the rental agency owner had kindly started a fire for us. I pulled the truck to a stop and killed the engine. The only sound was the wind whispering through the towering pines. "We're here," I said. Leo didn't move. He just stared out the window at the dense wall of trees. "It's the middle of nowhere." His voice was flat, an accusation. That's the point, I replied, trying to keep my own tone even. I got out of the truck and walked around to the back to get our bags. He remained in his seat, unmoving. I grabbed his duffel bag and my own, then walked to his door and opened it. Come on, Leo. Let's get settled. He unfolded himself from the truck with a weary sigh, his movements slow and grudging. He looked at the cabin, then at the surrounding forest, his expression a mixture of contempt and anxiety. He was a city kid, born and raised. This raw, untamed nature was as alien to him as a foreign planet. The inside of the cabin was simple and clean. One large room served as both living area and bedroom, with two built-in bunks against one wall, a small kitchenette in the corner, and a worn leather sofa in front of a large stone fireplace. The air smelled of wood smoke and pine. It was cozy, but also undeniably small. There would be no escaping each other here. I dropped our bags on the floor. I'll take the top bunk, I said, trying to inject a note of normalcy into the situation. Leo just grunted in response, walking over to the small window and staring out. His hands were shoved deep into his pockets. I saw his fingers twitching. He was jonesing. The realization hit me with a fresh wave of dread. I didn't know the first thing about what he was about to go through. I was a carpenter, not a doctor. I was completely out of my depth. The first 24 hours were a cold war. Leo staked out his territory on the lower bunk, wrapping himself in a blanket like a cocoon, and refused to engage. He ate little of the food I prepared, pushing the scrambled eggs and toast around his plate with a fork. He refused to go outside. He just lay there, staring at the wooden slats of the bunk above him, his body tense and coiled. I tried to create a routine. I chopped wood for the fireplace, stacking it neatly on the small porch. I went for short walks, exploring the trails that led away from the cabin, always keeping it in sight. I tried to read a paperback I'd brought, but the words swam in front of my eyes. My focus was entirely on the boy lying on the bunk bed, radiating misery. The silence in the cabin was thick with unspoken things. His anger, his resentment, his craving. My fear, my guilt, my desperate, clumsy hope. Every rustle of his blanket, every heavy sigh, was amplified in the quiet space. On the morning of the third day, the war turned hot. I woke up just after sunrise to the sound of him rummaging through the kitchenette. I sat up in my bunk and saw him yanking open drawers, his movements frantic and jerky. "What are you looking for?" I asked, my voice still rough with sleep. He spun around, his eyes wild. "Where is it?" "Where is what, Leo?" "My phone." "I know you have it. Where did you put it?" His voice was shrill, cracking with desperation. I had taken his phone before we left, along with his laptop. I'd put them in the glove compartment of the truck. It felt like a necessary amputation. "There's no signal out here anyway, Leo. It's useless." "I don't care. I want it. Give it to me," he screamed, his face contorted. He looked like a cornered animal. "No," I said, my voice firm. I swung my legs over the side of the bunk and stood up, placing myself between him and the door. That's when he lunged. It wasn't a real attack, it was a desperate, flailing attempt to push past me. He slammed into my chest, his fists beating weakly against me. I was so shocked by his physical state, he felt as light and fragile as a bird. There was no strength in him. I easily caught his wrists, holding him still. He struggled for a moment, then sagged against me, all the fight going out of him. A dry, racking sob tore through his body. "I need it," he choked out, his voice muffled against my shirt. I need to call someone." He wasn't talking about the phone anymore. We both knew it. The craving had become a physical agony. "I know," I said softly, my own voice thick with emotion. I held him there, my son, my stranger, as he trembled in my arms. "I know it hurts. But I'm not letting you do this. The withdrawal hit him with full force that afternoon. It was hell. A hell I was forced to witness. He writhed on the bunk, his body drenched in a cold sweat. He was plagued by muscle cramps that made him cry out in pain. He threw up the little water I managed to get him to drink. He alternated between shivering uncontrollably and burning with a fever that made his skin hot to the touch. There was nothing I could do but be there. I brought him a bucket. I wiped his forehead with a cool, damp cloth. I sat on the floor beside his bunk, my back against the log wall, and just watched. I watched my son, my beautiful boy, be tormented by a demon I had allowed to take hold of him. Every groan, every pained whimper, was a nail being driven into my own heart. The guilt was a physical presence in the room, as real as the smell of vomit and sweat. This was my fault. I had failed him. I had been so lost in my own grief that I had left him to drown in his. Sometime late that night, in the darkest, quietest hours before dawn, a change occurred. The violent, physical symptoms began to subside, leaving him utterly spent. He lay still, his breathing shallow. The fire in the hearth had burned down to glowing embers, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. I must have dozed off, my head slumped against the wall, because I was startled awake by a sound. It was the sound of weeping. Not the loud, angry sobs of before, but a quiet, broken, hopeless crying. It was the sound of a heart breaking. I looked over at the bunk. Leo was on his side, his face buried in his pillow, his thin shoulders shaking. I pushed myself to my feet, my joints aching, and went to him. I sat on the edge of the mattress. It dipped with my weight. He didn't pull away. "Leo?" I whispered. He didn't answer, but the crying continued, a raw, desolate sound that seemed to come from the very core of his being. I hesitantly reached out and placed a hand on his back. I could feel the sharp ridge of his spine through his damp t-shirt. He flinched at my touch but didn't shrug it off. "I miss her," he choked out, the words so quiet I could barely hear them over the sound of my own heartbeat. "I miss Mom so much." And there it was. The real sickness. The wound beneath the wound. The addiction was just a symptom, a clumsy, destructive attempt to numb a pain that was too great to bear. "Me too, kid," I whispered, my own throat closing up. "God, I miss her too." He rolled over to face me. In the dim, orange glow of the embers, his face was a ghostly white, tracked with tears. His eyes, for the first time in months, were clear. Not clear of pain, but clear of the drug-induced haze. They were just the eyes of a sad, lost boy. She would be so ashamed of me," he whispered. "No," I said, my voice firm, resolute. "No, she wouldn't. She would be heartbroken that you're in so much pain. And she'd be angry at me for not seeing it sooner." I finally said it. I admitted my own failure out loud. To him. He just looked at me, his eyes searching my face. And then he did something that nearly broke me. He reached out and weakly gripped the front of my shirt, like a small child seeking comfort. He buried his face in my side, and his quiet weeping turned into deep, gut-wrenching sobs. I didn't know what to do. My instincts, dulled by 2 years of emotional distance, were screaming. So I just followed them. I wrapped my arms around my son's trembling shoulders and held him. I held him as he cried for his mother, for his lost childhood, for the pain he had inflicted on himself. And as I held him, my own tears, the ones I had swallowed and choked down for 2 long years, began to fall silently into his hair. There in the near darkness of a remote mountain cabin, surrounded by the sleeping forest, a father and son finally began to grieve together. It wasn't a solution. It wasn't a cure. But it was a beginning. A fragile, painful, desperately needed beginning. The dawn that followed that long, dark night felt different. The light that filtered through the cabin window seemed softer, less accusatory. The air itself felt lighter, as if the storm of emotion had scrubbed the atmosphere clean. Leo was still asleep, his breathing deep and even for the first time in days. He looked impossibly young, the lines of pain and anger smoothed from his face, leaving only a fragile exhaustion. I moved quietly, rekindling the fire, putting on a pot of coffee. The simple, domestic tasks felt grounding. For the first time, I felt a flicker of something that wasn't panic or guilt. It was a fragile, tentative hope. We had broken through a wall. We hadn't fixed anything, not really, but we had acknowledged the wound. We had named the grief that sat at the center of our lives. When Leo finally woke, late in the morning, the tension between us was gone. In its place was an awkward, delicate truce. He was weak, washed out, but the frantic, desperate energy was gone. He accepted the toast and glass of water I offered him without protest, eating slowly, deliberately. "How are you feeling?" I asked, my voice gentle. He shrugged, not meeting my eyes. "Empty," he said. It was an honest answer. I accepted it. "Okay," I said. "Empty is a start." The next few days were about filling that emptiness with something other than pain. We established a new, simple rhythm. I didn't push him. I didn't lecture. I just created opportunities. In the mornings, I would chop wood. After a day or two of just watching me from the porch, he came over and started stacking the logs I split. He didn't say anything, just picked up the pieces of wood and placed them carefully on the growing pile. The shared, repetitive work became a form of communication. The thud of my axe, the clatter of the wood he stacked at it was a conversation without words. In the afternoons, we started going for walks. At first, they were short, just to the edge of the clearing and back. Leo's legs were unsteady, his stamina non-existent. But with each day, we went a little farther. We followed a deer trail that wound down to a rushing creek, its water crystal clear and achingly cold. We sat on the smooth, gray stones and listened to the sound of the water flowing over the rocks. During one of these walks, Leo stopped and pointed to a plant with broad, velvety leaves. "Mullen," he said, his voice quiet. I looked at him, surprised. "How do you know that?" "Mom taught me," he said, a faint, sad smile touching his lips. "She said you could use the leaves to make a tea for coughs. She knew all the plants up here. She loved this mountain." It was the first time he had volunteered a memory of her, a happy one. It was a small gift, and I treasured it. "Yeah," I said, my own voice a little thick. "She did. She called it her cathedral." We stood there for a moment in the quiet of the forest, sharing the memory, connected by our mutual love for the woman who had brought us both here, in her own way. The progress wasn't a straight line. There were bad hours and bad days. Times when a shadow would cross his face, when he would retreat into a sullen silence, and I would feel a spike of the old fear. I saw him clenching his fists, his jaw tight, fighting an internal battle I could only guess at. During those times, I learned to give him space, but not to let him be alone. I would sit with him, quietly reading or mending a tool, my presence a silent statement, "I'm here. I'm not leaving." One evening, as we were sitting by the fire, I decided it was time. I pulled the locket from the small wooden box where I'd kept it. I had been carrying it with me, waiting for the right moment. I held it out to him in my open palm. He stared at it, his expression unreadable. He didn't take it. "I was never going to sell it," he said softly, his eyes fixed on the fire. I think I wanted to get caught. I think I was screaming for help, and that was the only way I knew how." The honesty of his confession hit me hard. He wasn't making an excuse. He was trying to understand his own desperation. "I hear you now, Leo," I said. "I'm sorry it took me so long." He finally looked at me, and then down at the locket in my hand. "Why a willow tree?" he asked. "The engraving." I closed my hand around the locket, the metal warm. Your mother chose it. She said willows are one of the strongest trees. They can bend in a storm without breaking. They can lose their branches and grow new ones. And their roots can find water almost anywhere. I looked at him, hoping he would understand. She said it represented resilience. The ability to survive. He was quiet for a long time, absorbing that. He still didn't take the locket, and I didn't press him. I put it back in its box. It was enough that we had talked about it. We were rebuilding, one small, honest conversation at a time. The days bled into a week, and then nearly 2. The color was returning to Leo's face. He was eating more, sleeping better. He even sketched a little, using a piece of charcoal from the fire pit and the back of a grocery receipt. He drew the creek, the towering pines, the sharp profile of the mountain. It was a shadow of his old talent, but it was there. I saw a glimpse of the boy I thought I had lost forever. I was starting to feel a dangerous sense of optimism. I started thinking about the next steps, getting him into a proper treatment program when we got back to Portland, finding a family therapist. Maybe we could actually get through this. Maybe we had weathered the worst of the storm. I was a fool. I had forgotten that addiction is a patient, cunning enemy. It waits for a moment of weakness. It waits for you to let your guard down. The moment came on a Tuesday night, 2 weeks into our stay. A storm was rolling in, the sky a dark, bruised purple. The wind had picked up, howling through the trees, rattling the window panes of the cabin. A forecast on the truck radio had warned of a major system, with heavy rain and high winds. We had spent the evening playing a tense game of checkers. I had won, and Leo had feigned a dramatic, over-the-top frustration that had actually made me laugh. It felt normal. It felt good. We cleaned up, banked the fire for the night, and went to our bunks. "Night, Dad," he said, his voice quiet from the bunk below. "Good night, Leo," I replied, my heart feeling full. I fell asleep easily, lulled by the sound of the wind and the rain starting to lash against the roof. I felt safe. I felt we were safe. I don't know what woke me. Maybe it was a shift in the wind, or a branch cracking outside. But I sat up suddenly in the pitch darkness, my heart pounding with an inexplicable sense of dread. The cabin was cold. The fire had died down more than it should have. "Leo?" I whispered into the darkness. Silence. I swung my legs out of the bunk, my bare feet hitting the cold wooden floor. I reached for the bunk below me. It was empty. The blankets were thrown back. A cold, sick dread washed over me. "Leo!" I called out, louder this time. No response. I fumbled for the flashlight I kept by my bed, my hands shaking so badly I could barely work the switch. The beam cut a frantic path through the darkness. He wasn't in the kitchenette. He wasn't on the sofa. He was gone. My eyes shot to the hook by the door where I hung the keys to the truck. It was empty. The plan hit me like a physical blow. He had waited. He had played along. He had lulled me into a false sense of security, waiting for his chance. And now he had taken it. He was going to try and drive back to the city, back to his dealers, back to the poison. I threw on my boots and jacket, not even bothering with socks. I burst out the cabin door into the teeth of the storm. The wind tore at me, and the rain was a solid, freezing sheet of water. The truck was still there. For a split second, relief washed over me, so intense it made me dizzy. But then the dread returned, 10 times worse. If he hadn't taken the truck, then where was he? He had run. On foot. Into the forest. In the middle of a major storm, in the dead of night. He wasn't just running back to the drugs. He was running from me. He was running from this fragile new connection we had built. The despair and self-hatred that the addiction fed on had won. He had chosen the storm outside over the storm inside. I stood there on the porch, the freezing rain soaking me to the bone, and screamed his name into the roaring wind. The sound was swallowed by the storm. My son was out there, alone, in the dark, in the wild. And the terror I felt was a cold, sharp thing. It wasn't just the fear of him relapsing. It was the primal, gut-deep fear of losing him for good, not to an overdose in a city alley, but to the vast, indifferent wilderness that surrounded us. The mountain that had been our sanctuary had just become a trap. Panic is a cold, sharp thing. It bypassed all rational thought and shot straight into my limbs. My only instinct was to run, to plunge into the roaring darkness after him. I grabbed the powerful flashlight from the truck, its beam cutting a frantic, shaky path into the churning chaos of the woods. "Leo!" I bellowed, my voice raw against the shriek of the wind. The rain was torrential, plastering my hair to my skull and streaming into my eyes. Every tree looked the same, a dark, menacing silhouette. The forest floor, normally soft with pine needles, was quickly becoming a slick, treacherous morass of mud and water. Where would he go? He didn't know these woods. He had no gear, no compass, nothing but the clothes on his back and the desperation in his heart. The main road was miles away. Was he trying to reach it? Or was he just running blindly, putting distance between himself and me, between himself and this forced sobriety? I saw them then. Footprints. Barely visible in the muddy ground leading away from the cabin, heading not towards the gravel track we drove in on, but deeper into the forest, towards the creek. They were already filling with water, fading with every fresh downpour. He had a head start, but how long? 10 minutes? 20. A part of my brain, the calm, methodical craftsman, tried to assert itself over the terrified father. Think, David. Don't just run. He's on foot. He's weak. He can't have gotten far. He'll follow the path of least resistance. The deer trail. The trail down to the water. I plunged into the trees, following the faint trail, my flashlight beam dancing wildly over wet ferns and the slick, black bark of the firs. The wind howled, a malevolent, living entity, throwing branches and debris in my path. It felt personal, as if the mountain itself was trying to stop me. Every shadow looked like a figure. Every snap of a twig sounded like a footstep. "Leo, please!" I shouted, the words torn from my throat. "This is insane. Come back." Only the storm answered. The trail grew steeper, slicker. I slipped, my knee crashing hard against a hidden root. A sharp, hot pain shot up my leg, but I ignored it, scrambling back to my feet, mud caked on my hands and jeans. The beam of my flashlight caught something on the ground. A small, dark square. His wallet. It had fallen from his pocket. I snatched it up. It was empty, of course. He had no money, no ID. He was a ghost out here. The sound of the creek was getting louder, a dull roar that was audible even over the wind. He was heading for the water. Why? Was he trying to follow it downstream, hoping it would lead him somewhere? Or was his mind so clouded by the craving, by the despair, that he wasn't thinking at all? The terror in my chest was beginning to morph into a cold, hard anger. Anger at him, for this stupid, self-destructive act. For throwing away the progress we'd made. For putting himself in this mortal danger and forcing me to witness it. But beneath the anger was the raw, paralyzing fear. The memory of the phone call from the hospital 2 years ago, the doctor's calm, devastating voice telling me Sarah was gone. I couldn't survive another call like that. I couldn't lose the only piece of her I had left. I broke through the final line of trees and found myself on the bank of the creek. It was transformed. The gentle stream we had sat by just days before was now a churning, brown torrent, swollen with rainwater, carrying logs and debris downstream at a terrifying speed. It was a death trap. My light swept across the opposite bank, then upstream, then down. Nothing. He wasn't here. Had he tried to cross? The thought sent a jolt of ice through my veins. He wouldn't stand a chance. Leo. My scream was one of pure, primal desperation. And then I heard it. Faint, but unmistakable. A voice. Carried on a brief lull in the wind. Dad? It was weak, Freddy. It came from downstream, farther down the bank. I scrambled along the edge of the raging water, my flashlight beam bouncing, searching. The slick rocks were treacherous. I nearly went down twice, my ankles twisting. And then I saw him. He was huddled at the base of a huge, fallen cedar tree, its massive root ball ripped from the earth, creating a shallow overhang that offered the barest protection from the rain. He was soaked, shivering violently, his arms wrapped around his knees, which were drawn up to his chest. He looked small and broken. Relief washed over me so powerfully my legs almost gave out. It was a tidal wave of emotion, so potent it left me breathless. He was alive. He was here. I slid down the muddy bank towards him, my knee screaming in protest. Leo, I said, my voice breaking. He looked up at me, his face pale and gaunt in the stark light of the flashlight. His eyes were wide, not with anger or resentment, but with a profound, desolate fear. The fight was gone. The rebellion was gone. All that was left was a terrified kid, lost in the woods, lost in his life. I got lost, he whispered, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. It got so dark. I thought I could follow the water. It's okay, I said, my voice thick. It's okay, son. I've got you. I reached for him, and this time he didn't pull away. He collapsed against me, his body limp with exhaustion and cold. He was freezing, his skin like ice even through his wet clothes. Hypothermia. The thought jolted me back into action. We had to get him back to the cabin. Now. Can you walk? I asked. He tried to push himself up, but his legs were shaking too badly. He couldn't support his own weight. He looked at me with helpless, pleading eyes. It's okay, I said again, my voice more forceful this time, trying to project a confidence I didn't feel. We're going to get you home. I crouched down, turning my back to him. Get on. He hesitated for a second. Dad, I can't. Yes, you can, I insisted. Get on my back. Now. He complied, his movements clumsy and weak. I looped his arms over my shoulders and hooked my own arms under his knees, taking his full weight. He was terrifyingly light. I could feel the sharp bones of his knees digging into my forearms. I grunted with the effort and pushed myself up to a standing position, my bad knee screaming in protest. The journey back was a nightmare. Every step was a battle. The weight of my son, light as he was, felt immense. My muscles burned. My knee was a constant, throbbing agony. The wind and rain were relentless, trying to push us back down, to keep us in the dark. Leo was quiet at first, his head resting on my shoulder, his breathing shallow. But as we trudged on, I could feel him shivering less violently. The warmth from my body was beginning to seep into his. He was a dead weight, but he was a living weight. I'm sorry, he mumbled into my ear, his voice barely audible. I'm so sorry, Dad. Don't talk, I grunted, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other. Save your energy. We're almost there. I don't know how long it took. It felt like an eternity. My world shrank to the small, illuminated circle of mud and rain in front of my feet. It was a pure test of will. Every step was a refusal to fail. Every painful breath was an act of defiance against the storm, against the addiction, against the despair that had driven my son out into the night. I was literally carrying him out of the darkness. I was carrying him back to a chance at life. Finally, through the sheeting rain, I saw it. A faint, welcoming orange glow. The light from the cabin window. I had left a lamp on. Hope, fierce and desperate, surged through me, giving me a final burst of strength. I stumbled the last few yards and practically fell against the cabin door, fumbling it open with one hand. I half-carried, half-dragged Leo inside and kicked the door shut behind us, finally sealing out the storm. We collapsed onto the floor in a heap of mud, water, and exhaustion. For a moment, we just lay there, gasping for breath in the sudden, shocking quiet of the cabin. The only sounds were the crackle of the embers in the fireplace and our own ragged breathing. I rolled over, my body screaming in protest, and looked at my son. He was pale, his lips tinged with blue, but his eyes were open. He was looking at me. And in his gaze, I saw the ruins of his pride, the ashes of his rebellion. What I saw was a surrender. Not to me, but to the fact that he couldn't do this alone. I had gone out into the storm to find a runaway. A prisoner. An addict. But the person I carried back was just my son. My lost, hurting son. And I knew, as I lay there on the floor of that rustic cabin, that something fundamental had just broken. But this time, it might have been the thing that needed to break all along. The moments after we fell through the door were a blur of urgent, focused action. The adrenaline that had fueled my search was replaced by a cold, clear purpose. Get him warm. Get him safe. My own pain, the throbbing in my knee, the exhaustion in my muscles, faded into the background. Okay, Leo. Let's go. We have to get you out of these clothes, I said, my voice leaving no room for argument. I was already on my feet, stripping off my own soaking jacket and shirt. He was too weak to protest, too exhausted to do anything but comply. I helped him peel off the wet layers of his clothing, his body shivering violently as the cool air hit his skin. His skin was frighteningly pale, almost translucent. I could count every one of his ribs. Seeing him like this, so vulnerable and exposed, was like a physical blow. The evidence of his self-neglect was laid bare, and the guilt I felt was sharp and immediate. I grabbed every dry blanket and towel I could find and wrapped him in them, cocooning him on the sofa as close to the fireplace as I could get him. I worked quickly, adding logs to the embers, coaxing the weak glow back into a roaring, life-giving flame. The fire crackled and spat, casting a warm, flickering light over his pale face. His shivering was starting to subside, but he was drifting, his eyes fluttering closed. He was mumbling something, his words slurred and indistinct. I leaned closer to hear. "Mom," he whispered, his eyes still closed. "Is it cold?" The word, the name, hung in the warm air of the cabin. It wasn't a question for me. In his hypothermic, exhausted delirium, his mind had gone to her. To his first source of comfort and safety. My heart clenched. "It's okay, son," I whispered back, my voice thick. "You're warm now. You're safe." I wasn't sure if he could hear me. I wasn't sure if I was talking to him or to myself. I spent the next hour in a state of hypervigilance. I heated water on the small gas stove and managed to get him to sip some, holding the mug to his lips. I sat by his side, constantly checking his breathing, feeling his skin for warmth. The blue tinge was receding from his lips, and a faint flush was slowly returning to his cheeks. He had fallen into a deep, exhausted sleep. The immediate danger was passing. The storm still raged outside, but inside the cabin, a profound quiet had fallen. With nothing left to do but watch him breathe, the events of the night came crashing down on me. I sank into the armchair opposite the sofa, my body finally succumbing to its own aches and pains. My knee was swollen and throbbing, a dull, insistent agony. I looked at my son, sleeping in the firelight. This beautiful, broken boy who had inherited his mother's artistic soul and my own stubborn pride. The combination had nearly killed him tonight. He had run from me, from the confinement of this cabin, from the pain of withdrawal. He had run straight into the arms of a different, more immediate danger. And in doing so, he had been forced to confront a simple, brutal truth: he was not in control. His escape attempt wasn't an act of defiance against me. I saw that now. It was a final, desperate act of self-destruction. It was the addict's ultimate lie: I would rather die than feel this pain. He had tested that theory tonight, in the freezing rain and the dark. He had looked into the abyss, and for the first time, he had been truly afraid of what he saw. And me? I had looked into that same abyss. The thought of finding him gone, of the truck being missing, was terrifying. But the reality of finding the truck still there, of knowing he had vanished into that wild, unforgiving forest, that was a terror of a different magnitude. It was the terror of absolute powerlessness. My anger, my plans, my stubborn will, none of it mattered when faced with the raw, indifferent force of nature. For a few agonizing hours, I had been completely at the mercy of chance. And I had been given a second one. A brutal, terrifying, undeserved second chance. I must have dozed off, because I awoke with a start to the sound of my name. Dad? Leo was awake. He had pushed himself up into a sitting position on the sofa, the blankets pooled around his waist. The fire had burned down to a gentle glow. The storm outside had lessened, the wind no longer howling, the rain now just a steady drumming on the roof. His eyes were clear and lucid. The delirium was gone. He looked at me, and there was no anger, no defiance. There was just a quiet, hollowed-out shame. "I'm sorry," he said again. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything that had happened. I just nodded, too emotionally drained to speak. He looked down at his hands, then back at me. When I was out there, when I got lost, I wasn't thinking about getting high anymore. I was just cold. I was so cold. And I thought, this is it. This is how it ends. All that stuff I told myself, that I was in control, that I could handle it, it was all a lie. I was going to die out there, for nothing. He paused, taking a shaky breath. And the stupidest part? The only thing I could think about was you. That you would be the one to find me. And I couldn't do that to you. Not after Mom. The confession hung in the air between us. It was the most honest thing he had said in years. He had hit rock bottom, not in a drug den, but in the cold mud at the base of a cedar tree. And at the bottom, he had found something he thought he'd lost, a reason to live. He had found us. I felt a cracking inside my own chest. A wall I didn't even know was still standing, a final bastion of my own stoic, grieving pride, crumbled into dust. I got up from my chair, wincing as my full weight came down on my bad knee, and went to the small wooden box on the mantelpiece. I took out the locket. I walked over to the sofa and sat down beside him. The cushions dipped, and our shoulders touched. He didn't pull away. I didn't give it to him. I just held it in my own palm, the silver catching the firelight. "This isn't about Mom," I said, my voice low and rough. "Not just about her." He looked at me, confused. "I gave this to her the week we found out she was pregnant with you," I began, the story I had held inside for so long finally coming out. "We were at a little diner, the one on Belmont that closed down. She was so nervous. She was worried she wouldn't be a good mother. She was afraid of everything that could go wrong." I looked from the locket to my son's face. "I gave her this, and I told her that the willow tree meant we would be strong enough, that we could bend. But I also made her a promise. I promised her that Wesh and I would always protect our greatest creation. That we would keep you safe. That we would love you, no matter what." I took a deep breath, the next words the hardest of all. "I broke that promise, Leo. When she died, I got lost, too. I hid in my work, and I let you get lost in your own pain. I stopped protecting you. What you did, the drugs, the lies, that was on you. But the silence that let it grow, that was on me. And I am so, so sorry. Tears were streaming down my face now. I didn't bother to wipe them away. Leo was crying too, silent tears tracking down his cheeks. He reached out and gently took the locket from my hand. He didn't look at it. He just held it, his fingers closing around the smooth, worn silver. He held it like he was holding on to a lifeline. The storm outside was finally breaking. Through the window, I could see the first, faint hint of gray light on the horizon. A new day was coming. I didn't know what it would bring. I knew this wasn't the end. This was just the end of the beginning. The road ahead was long and uncertain. But for the first time, I knew we wouldn't be walking it alone. We were just a father and a son, sitting in a borrowed cabin, surrounded by the wreckage of our lives. But we were together. And we were holding on. The drive back to Portland a few days later was the polar opposite of the drive out. The silence was still there, but it had changed its nature entirely. It was no longer a weapon or a shield. It was a shared space, comfortable and contemplative. The landscape, once a symbol of our isolation, now felt like a silent witness to our ordeal and our fragile truce. Leo sat in the passenger seat, not pressed against the door, but relaxed, occasionally looking over at me. He was still pale, still thin, but the frantic, haunted look in his eyes was gone. In its place was a quiet gravity, the look of someone who has stared into the abyss and has no desire to ever see it again. We had made a pact in the cabin. No more secrets. No more lies. We had talked for hours after the storm, laying out the ugly truths of the past 2 years. He told me how the prescription for his broken wrist had morphed into a crutch for his emotional pain, how he'd started buying pills from a kid at school, how the debt and the shame had spiraled out of control. I told him about the depth of my own grief, about how looking at him was like looking at a reflection of Sarah, and how the pain of it had made me turn away when I should have been pulling him closer. We didn't forgive each other, not in so many words. It was too soon for that. Instead, we acknowledged the damage. We agreed to survey the wreckage together. The first order of business upon returning to the city was not to go home. Home was still a minefield of memories and triggers. Instead, I drove us straight to a hospital that had a well-regarded youth addiction and mental health program. This was the part one dreaded, the part one had no idea how to navigate. But it was a promise I had made to him, and to myself. Walking through the automatic doors of the hospital felt like a surrender. It was an admission that this was bigger than me, bigger than a trip to a mountain cabin could fix. This required experts, a real plan. Leo was quiet, his hands shoved in his pockets, but he didn't resist. He walked beside me, a silent partner in his own rescue. The intake process was a bureaucratic hell of paperwork and hushed, clinical conversations. A kind but firm social worker named Maria sat with us in a small, sterile office. She asked Leo questions directly, her tone professional but not unkind. She asked about the drugs, the frequency, the duration. He answered honestly, his voice low but steady. He didn't look at me, but I could feel his shame radiating from him. I just sat there, my hands clenched in my lap, feeling like a useless bystander. Maria then turned to me. "Mr. Miller, this program requires a family commitment. Recovery isn't just about the patient. It's about changing the system they live in. Are you prepared to participate in family counseling sessions? To create a supportive and stable home environment?" "Yes," I said, the word coming out with more force than I intended. "Whatever it takes." The decision was made that Leo would enter a 30-day inpatient program. 30 days. A month without my son. A month of him being under the care of strangers. A part of me screamed in protest, the protective father instinct wanting to take him home, to keep him safe myself. But the man who had carried his near-frozen son out of a storm knew better. I wasn't enough. My love for him was absolute, but it wasn't a cure. He needed this. We needed this. Saying goodbye was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. We stood in a hallway that smelled of antiseptic and floor wax. There were no grand pronouncements. No dramatic tears. I just pulled him into a hug, a real one, holding him tight. "I'm proud of you," I whispered into his hair. "This is the hardest part. You can do this." "What are you going to do?" he asked, his voice muffled against my shoulder. "I'm going to go home," I said. "And I'm going to get it ready for you." He nodded, pulled away, and followed a nurse down the long, polished hallway without looking back. I stood and watched until he disappeared around a corner. The silence that descended then was the loneliest I had ever known. I drove home to an empty house. The silence that greeted me was the old kind, the heavy, mournful quiet I had lived in for 2 years. But this time, I refused to let it settle. I had a job to do. I had a promise to keep. I started in his room. For 2 years, it had been a closed-off territory, a symbol of our distance. Now, I opened the door and faced it. It was a mess, clothes on the floor, old plates hidden under the bed. But more than that, it was a shrine to his pain. I found the empty pill bottles hidden in the back of a drawer. I found paraphernalia I didn't recognize but whose purpose I could guess, tucked away in an old shoebox. Each discovery was a fresh stab of guilt. How could I not have known? I didn't just clean his room. I purged it. I gathered every piece of damning evidence, every reminder of his sickness, and put it all in a black garbage bag. It felt like an exorcism. I washed his sheets, opened the window to let the fresh air in, and scrubbed the room until it was clean. Then, I went to my workshop and found the sketches he had made at the cabin. I framed the one of the creek and hung it on his wall. It was a reminder not of his pain, but of his resilience. Of his survival. My work didn't stop there. I went through the whole house. I took the folded quilt of Sarah's out of the closet and draped it back over the armchair where it belonged. I found a photo of the 3 of us, laughing on a beach trip years ago, and put it on the mantelpiece. I was tired of living in a memorial. A home was for the living. It was time to let Sarah's memory be a source of warmth, not a reason to hide from life. The days were long and quiet. I threw myself into my work, but it was different now. I wasn't hiding in my workshop, I was building. I started a new project, a small, intricately carved wooden box made of walnut, with a willow tree inlaid on the lid in lighter maple. It was for the locket. A proper home for it. The work was slow, meticulous. It kept my hands busy and my mind focused. I spoke to Leo on the phone every few days. The calls were awkward at first, filled with long pauses. He sounded tired, distant. He told me about his group therapy sessions, about the other kids in the program. He never complained, but I could hear the struggle in his voice. I just listened. I didn't offer advice. I just told him I was thinking of him, that I was proud of him, that I was waiting for him. My own therapy started, too. The family sessions with Maria. At first, it was just her and me. I sat on a comfortable sofa in her calm, quiet office and talked. I talked about Sarah. I talked about my fear, my inadequacy as a single father, my guilt. I admitted out loud that I had been so afraid of doing it wrong that I had ended up doing nothing at all. Maria just listened, occasionally asking a question that would gently pry open another locked door in my mind. It was excruciating. And it was necessary. One afternoon, about 3 weeks into Leo's stay, my neighbor, Evelyn Gable, came over. She was a kind, retired woman who had been one of Sarah's closest friends. She found me in the workshop, sanding the lid of the walnut box. "David," she said, her expression gentle. "I haven't seen much of you or Leo lately. Is everything all right?" The old me would have mumbled something vague, a non-answer designed to end the conversation. But that was the old me. I put down the sandpaper and looked at her. "No, Evelyn, it hasn't been," I said. And then I told her. I told her everything. The pawn shop, the cabin, the storm. I didn't spare myself. She listened without interruption, her expression full of a sad, deep empathy. When I was finished, she reached out and put her hand on my arm. "Oh, David," she said softly. "Sarah always used to say you were like a beautiful, sturdy oak tree. But even oaks can't stand forever without water. You tried to do it all alone." She squeezed my arm. "You're a good man. And you're a good father. You just forgot how to be for a little while." Her simple, unvarnished kindness was almost my undoing. It was a reminder that I wasn't on an island. There were people who cared. I had just been too blind with my own grief to see them. The conversation left me feeling lighter, less alone in my struggle. The journey was still mine and Leo's, but knowing there were people on the shore, cheering for us, made all the difference. The 30 days were almost up. The real test was about to begin. The day I went to pick Leo up was bright and clear, a rare gift in the Portland autumn. I drove to the hospital with a knot of anxiety and hope tangled in my stomach. 30 days. It felt like a lifetime and no time at all. Had it been enough? Had we changed enough? He was waiting for me in the same lobby where I'd left him. He stood up when he saw me. He looked different. He'd gained some weight back, and the color had returned to his face. The dark circles under his eyes were gone. But the change was more than physical. He stood taller, his shoulders less slumped. He met my eyes directly, his gaze steady. "Hey, Dad," he said. His voice was calm. "Hey, son," I replied, a smile spreading across my face, a real one. "You ready to go home?" He nodded. "Yeah. I am." The drive home was quiet again, but it was a new kind of quiet. A quiet of anticipation. When we pulled into the driveway, he looked at the house, really looked at it, as if seeing it for the first time. "It looks," he started, then trailed off. "Different?" I finished for him. "Yeah," he said. "Brighter." We walked inside, and he stopped in the living room, taking it all in. His eyes landed on the quilt draped over the armchair, then on the photo of the three of us on the mantelpiece. A small, sad smile touched his lips. "It's good to see her smile," he said softly. He went upstairs to his room. I held my breath, waiting. A moment later, he came back down, his expression unreadable. "You cleaned up," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was just a statement of fact. He pointed to the framed sketch of the creek. "I like that." It was a start. A small, fragile beginning on our new foundation. The weeks that followed were a delicate dance. We were two people learning a new language, the language of open communication. We had rules, established with Maria's help. A curfew for him. Regular, mandatory family dinners where we actually talked. No closed doors, literally or figuratively. And weekly family therapy sessions. Those sessions were our workshop. Maria's office was the place we brought the raw, broken pieces of our relationship to see if we could fit them back together. It was often painful. We dredged up old hurts, old resentments. Leo talked about his loneliness after Sarah died, about feeling invisible. I talked about my fear and my retreat into the silence of my grief. There were times we left that office feeling raw and exhausted, the car ride home filled with a tense silence. But we always came back the next week. We were committed to the work. Slowly, painstakingly, things began to change. The forced dinner conversations became more natural. We talked about small things, a movie I saw, a song he liked, a funny story from his outpatient group therapy sessions. He started sketching again, filling a new notebook with drawings that were more confident, more full of life. He reconnected with a couple of his old friends, the ones who hadn't been part of his drug use. I heard laughter coming from his room for the first time in years. It was the most beautiful sound in the world. There were still hard days. Days when he was quiet and withdrawn, and I felt the old panic rising in my throat. Days when I would come home and he wasn't there, and I'd have a split second of terror before remembering he was at his support group meeting. Recovery, I was learning, wasn't a finish line you crossed. It was a path you chose to walk every single day. And my job was to walk it alongside him, not for him. About 2 months after he came home, I finished the walnut box. The wood was sanded to a satin smoothness, the maple inlay of the willow tree almost seeming to glow. The lid fit perfectly, closing with a satisfying, quiet click. I lined the inside with a piece of dark green velvet, a scrap I had saved from one of Sarah's old sewing projects. That evening, I found Leo in the living room, reading. I sat down beside him and placed the box on the coffee table between us. He looked at it, running his hand over the smooth wood of the lid. "It's beautiful," he said. "It's for this," I said, and I took the locket from my pocket. It had been in my possession this whole time, a silent reminder of how close we had come to losing everything. I opened the box and placed the locket gently on the velvet lining. The silver gleamed against the dark green. I looked at my son. "Its story isn't over, Leo. We're just adding a new chapter. A better one." He looked from the box to me, and his eyes were clear and deep. I saw sadness there, yes, for all that we had lost. But I also saw strength. I saw the resilience of the willow tree. "Can I have it?" he asked, his voice quiet. I nodded. "It's yours. It was always meant to be yours." He picked up the locket. He didn't put it on. He just held it in his palm, feeling its weight, its history. He then carefully placed it back in the box and closed the lid. He was taking ownership of the memory, but he wasn't going to be defined by it. He was choosing to protect it. He stood up and went over to the mantelpiece, placing the small wooden box next to the picture of our family. It looked right there. A symbol not of loss, but of a promise. A promise renewed. He turned back to me, and for the first time, I saw a genuine, unburdened smile spread across his face. It was his mother's smile. And this time, it didn't hurt to see it. It felt like coming home. "So," he said, his smile turning into a mischievous grin. "What's for dinner? Please don't say it's that healthy stuff Maria recommended." I laughed, a real, deep laugh that came from my soul. "No," I said, getting up from the chair. "Tonight, I was thinking pizza. The greasiest, most unhealthy pizza we can find." "Now you're talking," he said, following me into the kitchen. As we stood there, arguing good-naturedly over which toppings to get, I knew we would be okay. The path ahead was still long, and there would be storms. But we had learned to be resilient. We had learned to talk. We had learned to lean on each other. The silence in our house had finally been filled, not with grief, but with the quiet, sturdy, and unmistakable sound of healing.